State Representative Darrell Metcalf. The state Senate recently voted a transportation funding plan. Unfortunately, this legislation did not get the media attention it truly deserved. Senate Bill 1 uncaps the oil company franchise tax, which means we could see a 28 cents per gallon increase at the pump. This bill also raises the vehicle registration fee from $36 a year to $104 every 2 years, a $32 increase over the current cost. More money will also be thrown into the black hole of mass transit. Instead of increasing taxes and fees to generate revenue out of the pockets of hardworking taxpayers, we should look to other areas ripe for cuts. If we cut the Department of Welfare budget by 10%, we could generate over $1 billion in revenue. Using the money from the sale of liquor stores could also generate $1 billion. Tax and fee increases are the wrong answer to funding roads and bridges. I will continue my fight to protect taxpayers. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this legislation that contains the Corbett gas tax increase. Mr. Speaker, this legislation contains a tax increase that will be to the tune of $2 billion with other associated fine and fee increases, Mr. Speaker.
$6.8 billion per year on our transportation infrastructure. That amount, that $6.8 billion, has doubled over the past 20 years. We spend the 11th highest amount per road mile of any state.
With this bill, House Bill 1060, both parties seem to want the same brand, and it's this: we, the elected elite, are the lords over the tax-paying serfs.
Double the taxes.
Who are you listening to? Who are you listening to? They don't want you to pass on a 28-cent tax. They don't want you to take that money from them and give it to the government. That's not what we're here for.
Triple the taxes.
Currently, we are spending nearly $72,000 per mile of road and bridge in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This ranks us as the 11th highest spending state in the country on transportation. Mr. Speaker, this will be the second largest tax increase in the history of this Commonwealth.
Let them eat cake.
And right now, what we're considering to do to the citizens of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is enact policies that will create, quite possibly, the highest gas tax in the United States of America, with Republicans in control of their government.
Squeeze every last drop out of those insolent musical peasants.
We already spend $6.2 billion on roads and bridges. And as Chairman Metcalf said, you would think that would be enough. The people back home are tapped out. They just had enough. And they really have had enough. We send enough money to Harrisburg to take care of what we do up here if we'd spend that money wisely.
The government is too big and spends too much of their money. Now, if that's the case, the answer is not to give government more money to spend. It's to prioritize our spending. Transportation is a core function of government. We recognize that. And we do need to have good roads and we do need to have good bridges. If we can't do it with the money we're spending, we're doing something wrong here.
It's a disgrace that we're faced with the choice of voting for bad government to get good roads, or voting for good government and ending up with bad roads. This transportation bill isn't just status quo, it's status quo in your face.
Let them eat cake.
People who own and operate an automobile, they pay a federal gasoline tax, a state gasoline tax, an inspection sticker fee, a vehicle registration fee, a driver's license fee. They pay sales tax when they buy the car. They pay a tire tax on every tire they buy, a tax on car leases if they lease their car. They pay for parking. They pay for parking tickets. They pay tolls, and they pay for traffic tickets. People who own and operate cars, they're paying for roads and bridges. People who ride mass transit pay for part of their bus fare. That's it. They contribute nothing to roads. They contribute nothing to bridges. Governor Corbett, Senate Bill 1, and the House Transportation Committee, they want people who own and operate cars to subsidize mass transit riders even more.
$6.2 billion, and we're asking the taxpayers to put in more. And my constituents see this as I'm going to be paying more for my vehicle maintenance, tires, to go to mass transit, to go to bike hike trails.
I don't understand, how do they want me to support a 28-cent a gallon tax increase, increasing the registration, increasing the fines on them, to do what? Give the government more money. We have more money than we've ever had before.
We're in the money. We're in the money. We've got a lot of what it takes to get along.
Mr. Speaker, over the period of time that this will be implemented, consumers could see up to 28 cents more per gallon of gas at the pump, Mr. Speaker. According to the American Petroleum Institute, our taxes on gas per gallon currently stand around 50.7 cents per dollar. Adding that 28 cents, we're up around 79 cents per gallon, Mr. Speaker. This increase, once it's fully implemented, has potential to make us the highest in the country, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, it is proper to ask what will be the economic consequences of this massive and historical tax increase.
And tell them that a vote was made to take even more money out of their pocket.
We're in the money. I say we're in the money. We've got a lot of what it takes to get along.
To understand what the economic impact will be of this historic tax increase. It will be negative, prolonged, and severe.
As my office looked through this legislation today and had some of my staff counting the fees and fine increases, they told me that they found over 130 fine and fee increases in this bill, Mr. Speaker, such as the annual increase for registration of an ambulance, increase in the vanity plates from $20 to $76, increase in the issuance of a certificate of title, annual registration of a messenger service from $50 to $192 fee. Mr. Speaker, counties will now have, under this legislation, the abilities to assess a $5 vehicle registration fee for any vehicle that's registered to an address in that county. Mr. Speaker, the legislation would funnel nearly $500 million a year in extra funding to mass transit. Both SEPTA and the Port Authority are already highly subsidized by the taxpayers of Pennsylvania, Mr. Speaker, while less than 5% of the Commonwealth's population actually use mass transit to commute for work, Mr. Speaker. SEPTA is subsidized by taxpayers to the tune of 60%, while the average route fare is only $1.95, and the Port Authority is subsidized to the tune of 70%, Mr. Speaker, by taxpayers. And they're asking for hundreds of millions of dollars, and we'll receive it through this legislation, Mr. Speaker.
The latest iteration of the bill I've seen is removing the at-the-pump tax and putting the full impact on the wholesaler. Except I can assure you as an economist that more than 90% of the wholesale tax will get passed back to the consumers, and they will pay close to 30 cents per gallon more at the pump as a result. So it's not just that we're going to hammer the taxpayer, we're going to lie to them too.
Not once was any option suggested by the proponents of this bill to address those needs except through a tax increase.
Mr. Speaker, there's been plenty of other options on the table that colleagues have put out there to address the issue of funding for roads and bridges without a tax increase, Mr. Speaker, such as elimination of the Turnpike Commission and joining that together with PennDOT to create efficiencies, Mr. Speaker.
I personally believe we should be abolishing the Turnpike. We've seen all the news about what goes on at the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Why do we have a separate Turnpike from PennDOT? With the Turnpike, look at this statistic. PennDOT has 7 executives for every 5,857 miles of roadway. The Turnpike has 9 executives for every 6 miles of roadway.
Why do we have issues with structurally deficient bridges? In part, Mr. Speaker, because we haven't taken the appropriate steps to control the costs of construction in this state. In particular, the prevailing wage, which artificially increases the cost to the taxpayers of public construction projects, including roads and bridges.
Prohibiting the State Transportation Commission from diverting any of Pennsylvania's allocation of federal funding that's dedicated for highways and bridges to the subsidizing of mass transit, as was done during the Rendell time in office, Mr. Speaker. Requiring DCNR to publicly auction at least 300,000 acres of state-owned land over 3 years for natural gas exploration and development, and use the royalties of that for infrastructure development improvement, Mr. Speaker. Taking funds from the sale of Pennsylvania's monopolized liquor control system and using that for improvement of our roads and bridges. Mr. Speaker, there's plenty of other ideas that could be utilized to address funding of roads and bridges in this state instead of a tax increase on the hardworking men and women of the state, Mr. Speaker. Government officials must learn to live within their means, just like the working, and she puts in parentheses, and I emphasize working, public. Cut the wasteful entitlement programs, the ones that promote a lifestyle of not getting off their duff, and find the money somewhere else. Increasing the fuels tax is not the answer to the shortfall in funding, because raising the fuel taxes will only lead to unnecessary burden on Pennsylvania citizens with exorbitant fuel prices, reduced consumption, hence reducing tax revenue, motorists purchasing fuel in our neighboring states where taxes are much lower, trucking and warehousing companies moving operations out of Pennsylvania due to high costs of doing business in the state, causing loss of tax revenue and loss of jobs, loss of thousands of jobs at Pennsylvania gas stations, truck stops, restaurants, and ancillary businesses due to loss of business to neighboring states. Probably one of the largest concerns I have on page 27 is that it says in that section that the department shall set aside 5% of the funds available for distribution, and that those would be available at the discretion and distribution by the Secretary, Mr. Speaker. So out of $300 million, the 5% of that $300 million, which would be, about $15 million. So you'd have about $15 million that would be available to be used at the discretion of the Secretary, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that as I've listened to our governor talk about eliminating the money that was available to legislatures in the form of WHAMs in the past, that this is a serious concern related to WHAMs of the future. I think that when you give any member of the governor's administration the discretion to spend millions of dollars, Mr. Speaker, at his discretion, that is a significant problem in that administrations can use that in a way to leverage the legislature to do what they'd like, and it ultimately would corrupt the process, Mr. Speaker. We've had past governors with their gubernatorial WHAMs. This, to me, seems like a new WHAM being set up for this administration and future administrations through the use of these millions of dollars at their discretion, Mr. Speaker. No one man or woman in this body or in the governor's office should be making a sole decision at their discretion on how to spend millions of taxpayer dollars, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just on the face of it, as the working public takes a look at what we're doing here, we took a couple of page bill dealing with a license plate, Mr. Speaker. And now it is this bill that's it's 127 pages, and that's been turned into this bill that contains over 100 fees and fines and a $2 billion tax increase, Mr. Speaker.
Taxes! Taxes! Beautiful, lovely taxes!
But why are we not looking at anything on the spending side? Representative Metcalf mentioned prevailing wage. We need prevailing wage reform.
I find it hard to believe that we're being asked to consider supporting an increase in taxation on our hardworking taxpayers and business people when we refuse to address some of the core elements that are driving our transportation cost, such as the cost of the regulations imposed by the Prevailing Wage Act.
Hi, I'm State Representative Darrell Metcalf. Next week, the legislature will be returning to session. Throughout the summer district work session, I've heard from taxpayers across the Commonwealth who support my efforts to oppose the Corbett gas tax increase. This initiative is being driven by the Department of Transportation, as well as businesses and unions that would benefit from the increased funding. In response to the House of Representatives not advancing the Corbett gas tax increase, the Transportation Secretary recently announced that exactly 1,000 state and local bridges would be weight restricted. Where was this list 6 months ago? What is PennDOT doing with the nearly $7 billion in state tax dollars it receives annually? Questions like this should leave taxpayers wondering if these 1,000 bridges are truly in dire need of repair. It is obviously a purely political maneuver in an attempt to shame the legislature into action. No unelected bureaucrat will ever shame me into voting for a tax increase. I will continue my fight to protect taxpayers who are taxed enough already.
The reason we're talking about a gas tax not being the right long-term solution is that we have very clear energy objectives in this country to consume less gasoline. And it's not just the price of gas today. We actually have mandated CAFE standards, which are the corporate average fleet efficiency. That's a federal government mandate to increase our fuel efficiency by 40% by 2016. That's a planned reduction in consumption of gasoline. So even if we were to pass a gas tax, we're planning on consuming less gasoline and actually encouraging the use of other fueled vehicles. So that means long term, this isn't the right solution. That's why we don't want to consider it.
Whose brain? Abby someone. Abby someone. Abby who? Abby normal.